Hello everyone, my name is Kira Gee. I'm a researcher and a consultant based in Germany. I work for a company called SPRO based in Berlin, but I'm also an academic. I'm based at the Herion Center near Hamburg, and I've done previous work in marine spatial planning in many projects. And today I'll be talking about stakeholder involvement in marine spatial planning. Just to give you an idea of the outline of the talk, I'd like to cover, first of all, why stakeholder involvement actually matters in marine spatial planning. Why do we go through all the effort to actually bring people to the table? I then want to cover who are stakeholders? What's a stakeholder? It's a term that is being used a lot. We hear it regularly in various MSP contexts, but who are these mysterious people we call stakeholders at the end of the day? And are they always the same? Or maybe is there different types, different categories of stakeholders? The third part I'd like to cover is when in an MSP process do we include stakeholders? The MSP process is quite a complex one. It's a cycle. I'm sure you've all seen diagrams of what that looks like. So different stages of that process, different opportunities, different timings of involving maybe also different types of stakeholders. The fourth part is looking a little bit more at methods and how that might happen, different ways of engaging people. And last not least, which is not on the slide here, I'd like to run you through an example, which is an ongoing MSP process, which is also involving stakeholders at different stages. That's the process of Germany. Germany is currently revising its MSP plans for the EEZ, and I'll show you a little bit about how stakeholders have been involved in that particular process. I'd like to start by considering the sea, which is the object of marine spatial planning. We are planning for sustainable seas, for sea use, for different activities. And I'd like to remind us all that the sea is in fact a place that carries many different meanings. So whoever looks at the sea might look at it through specific eyes, with a specific mindset, with specific intentions and attitudes. Because when we look out to the sea, it is really something that can be very personal, but the sea, of course, is also a social construct. It's something that has been used by society, by communities for centuries, for millennia, really, if you think about it. If you think of all the activities that go on there, shipping, trade, exploration, science, all those things have been going on for a long time. So those are the activities that have conditioned to some degree also how we as communities, as individuals, look at the sea, what we think the sea actually is, what we think the sea means, and what we think the sea is for at the end of the day. So the sea really is a setting at the end of the day for contemporary society, certainly for both generating monetary value, so making money, for industry, for using the sea's resources, but also for non-monetary value. So the beauty, for example, that is in the sea, symbolic meanings that might be attached to it, place-based meanings that might be attached to it. The good feeling we all get when we are on the beach and we look out to a sunset, it just makes us feel good and it makes us feel happy. Here's an example of what the sea means to local residents. It's taken from a survey, which is quite old now. It was done almost 10 years ago in a part of Germany called Schleswig-Holstein. And it really looked at how do ordinary people, very ordinary people, actually perceive the sea. So when they stand on their coast and they look out, what do they see? And I've brought these quotes to show you just how rich these descriptions are and how people really get a lot of emotional, a lot of aesthetic benefits from looking out to the sea. So one person says, it's the wide horizon, it influences the soul and physical health. It makes me feel good, it makes me feel away from hectic life. Or the second person saying, it's about life, it's shipping, there's boats, it's infinite, it's creation. It's unpredictable, but it also gives me comfort. And the last person looking very much through aesthetic eyes, saying to me, it's all about listening to the water, looking at the sun, the patterns it makes on the water, the storms, the waves, the drama, also of when the waves crash on the shore. And I'm only showing you this to emphasize that there's this diversity of attitudes, this diversity of associations and meanings we all have with the sea. And that's a little bit different to what MSP normally contends with, because MSP is very much about activities that go on. It's about all the various uses that go on, like shipping, like offshore wind farming, like sand and gravel extraction, many other sectors that make use of the sea. So it's these other perspectives here that are very utilitarian. But then there's also the conservation angle, and the idea of the sea as a natural space, of wilderness maybe, something to be protected because of important species, because of important habitats. At this point, if you like, I'd like to invite you to just stop the presentation for a moment and to think yourself about the sea that is near you, maybe, or a sea or a beach or a coast that you like. And just spend a minute thinking about, what does that actually mean to you? Being by the sea, engaging with the sea, maybe you are a user. Maybe you are a person who is out on the sea every day for a job. What does that sea mean to you? What do you think it's for? What do you think society should do with it? How should it be utilized? The reason why I think all this is important is that at the end of the day, what drives the various attitudes and opinions we have about the sea and how it should be used and how it should be managed has a lot to do with our own personal value sets, the beliefs we have about the sea, and what we think is important in life. So, for example, whether we give support to certain developments in the sea, or whether we are really adamantly opposed to some other development, that has a lot to do with what we think the sea is, what we think the sea should be, and how we think humans should actually utilize the sea, its space, and its resources. And that value base is really, really important also to bear in mind, because that has a lot to do with conflicts that MSP is really trying to resolve. And so because different values matter to different people, that can often lead to conflicts over resource use and how we think different activities combined or not combined in the sea. And very often these conflicts are really, at the end of the day, a value conflict, and they can be extremely emotional. And just one example, if you think about nature conservation interests on the one hand and how you might feel really strongly about protecting a habitat or a species, that's a very emotional thing, and that might clash really quite substantially with something like offshore wind farming or shipping, something that's perceived to be a threat to those conservation values, to those emotions, to those personal values that you carry in yourself. And I'm also emphasizing the fact that some of these non-monetary values and some of these emotional attachments, some of these deep-seated important things are very often overlooked when we actually do MSP, because the other activities, the other uses tend to be more prominent and tend to be the ones we focus on. So the first message is it's important to recognize these different values in MSP processes in order to understand some of the underlying conflicts, or the reasons for conflicts, and also to be able to come to trade-off decisions in marine spatial planning that are acceptable to people. Moving on to the next topic, which is, okay, so we've understood different people have different values and different people think different things are important when it comes to using the sea. So who, at the end of the day, are these people we are talking about that matter in marine spatial planning, or maybe should matter in marine spatial planning? So who are the stakeholders? I've brought a very simple definition, first of all, which reads: a stakeholder in marine spatial planning is any individual, group, or organization that is, or will be affected, involved, or interested, both positively or negatively, by approaches to marine management, or you could also say by marine spatial planning. This is not just an academic definition. Here's an example from a long way away from South Africa. It's the definition of stakeholders that the South African MSP process is using, and they say a stakeholder is understood as being a legal person or individual that represents or has an interest in the ocean and is engaged in marine activities or uses. So you see already that this is a pretty broad brush definition. So lots of different potential stakeholders that could be meant by this. And just to illustrate a little bit more what that might mean, here's another example from South Africa, who have divided those stakeholders into three broad categories, namely the first being government stakeholders. So that would be in South Africa the various departments. In Europe that would be called ministries. It would be provincial authorities or regional authorities, but also the more local, the municipal authorities, coastal communities, in other words. Then there's public enterprises and other state agencies that can all be lumped under this heading of government stakeholders. Then there's another large block, that's industry. So that's anyone who represents a marine sector that's operating in a planning area. And that's really all the various activities, all the various uses that are making use of that planning area. And the third really important group is civil society. So that would be more NGOs, research, and any other citizen or community-based organisation. This subdivision is actually a fairly common one and a very useful one, a good way of actually classifying stakeholders, just to make sure that all these bases are touched, just to make sure that no one is forgotten. So it's actually a very useful reminder also, who do we need to think about, who perhaps ought to be approached. So let's look at why do we actually want to involve these various bodies, these various stakeholders? And there's a whole long list of reasons for involving stakeholders. Also, if you read literature, if you read handbooks, these are the common reasons that you'll find mentioned in many of those. So the first reason is that in marine spatial planning, we very often want to create awareness, first of all, that MSP is going on. And also, what's the point of MSP? What's the purpose? What are the benefits that people are hoping to get from marine spatial planning? The second reason is to create a sense of ownership of a plan and also to build trust among these stakeholders and the decision makers, so the people who are tasked with making that marine spatial plan, and the stakeholders who are, at the end of the day, going to be regulated by it. So it's really to bring them in fairly early in the process in order to co-develop, ideally, this marine spatial plan with them, so that they have a sense that it's also their plan. It's not just something that has come top down and now they're stuck with it. Now they have to abide by it. So that's really the third point. If we can make sure that stakeholders are on board from the beginning and understand why there is a plan and what it's trying to do, then chances are that people are going to be more compliant. They're going to be more willing to stick to the rules and regulations that the plan is setting out. The fourth reason is also when stakeholders are involved, it is a way of developing a better mutual or a shared understanding of where the problems really are, or the challenges in a planning area, because chances are that before MSP came along, maybe there wasn't all that much dialogue between the different sectors, between maybe conflicting objectives as well. So MSP can be a way to actually bring people together, sometimes for the first time, for them to actually talk to each other and to really understand, okay, well, what are we actually both about? What are we trying to do in the sea? And that then leads on to point number 5, which is to help look for synergies also between the different sea uses and to identify, well, okay, Where are the conflicts likely to be really severe, and where are we really likely to need MSP to come up with a solution? So those are all the good sides of stakeholder involvement, why we tend to want to do it. But especially if you read the academic literature, you'll find that there's also what has been called the dark side of involvement, which is that it can sometimes just be a token. It's not really involvement, but actually really just informing people. And if it's really a bad case, it can actually also be a case of stakeholder manipulation, buying them off in some way. So not really in the sense that is depicted here. Some good reasons why stakeholder involvement can bring many benefits. Again, South Africa as an example. Here you have their reasons why, kind of in a nutshell. And they say, again, in engaging stakeholders, the South African government seeks to ensure that the MSP process is transparent, is coordinated, and that stakeholders understand how they can be involved, how they can contribute, and how they can influence the plan's development. And then the second part actually is quite important. It says, in addition, the MSP Act, which is their legal base that enables MSP in South Africa, actually prescribes stakeholder engagement in the process. So that is an even stronger reason, of course, to do this, because it is actually a legal requirement to do so. This is the slide, which is really just to summarize once again the reasons there are for involving stakeholders. And it's quite interesting and quite useful, I think, to be clear on what your purpose might be. So the first ones are the ones we've seen already in the previous slides. They tend to be the common ones, and they are called instrumental reasons, because really it's using stakeholder input for a particular purpose. So you want something from that involvement for the MSP process or for the MSP plan. So, for example, you might choose to involve stakeholders to get their data or to tap their knowledge or to get their input into the plan. The acceptance aspect we've already talked about, conflicts, regulations, all those we've already spoken about. They tend to be the more instrumental reasons, if you like. There's also normative reasons for wanting to involve stakeholders. Normative being more about democratic principles, so the social norms or the legal norms that might encourage us to do this. And it could be something like wanting to promote equality among stakeholders, or just because it's a democratic process, we want to make sure that we are following democratic principles in MSP. And the third one is also an interesting one. It's mostly talked about, I believe, in an academic context for now, but it's a transformative reason for wanting to involve stakeholders. And that could be really quite powerful and really quite transformative in the sense that you might want to involve stakeholders to actually change the way MSP is being done, or to change the system in which marine planning and marine spatial planning takes place. Or you might want to involve stakeholders specifically also to empower them, to really enable them to find their voice, to really make a difference to the process. So that's just to bear in mind, maybe useful, maybe quite interesting to think about those three categories. We move on next to the process of engaging stakeholders, and usually it's easier to depict it as a step-by-step process, which starts with the question of who should be involved. So that's really what we've been talking about. Who are the stakeholders? Identifying them, assessing them, then thinking a little bit about when in the process should different stakeholders be involved, and also think about how, what methods are we going to use for stakeholder involvement. And you see the different steps there. So after stakeholder assessment, there would be a stage where you plan the various activities, the various engagement that you have chosen. And then you actually go and talk to them and tell them what's happening and invite them to the process. Stakeholder mapping, again, we've already talked about this. This is just a recap. Stakeholder mapping basically means identifying who those stakeholders are under those three headings we've already seen in a previous slide. And it's important to say that there's no real magic way of identifying stakeholders for a particular MSP process. It tends to be something that's quite iterative. So you might start with the usual suspects, if you like, but some stakeholders might tell you, oh, someone else, perhaps a different group, would be interesting. They've also got a stake in the marine environment. Let's invite them as well. It also, of course, depends on what kind of uses the planning area is subject to. So who, are the different sectors that are important. And here's an example of just a few of them. And the same with civil society. So think broad, be creative, and also take up suggestions coming from stakeholders already identified. So that's really the first step you're thinking about. Why are we involving them? Who are they? And who are they specifically in the planning area? Who do I really want around my table? Who do I really want to be part of this MSP process? So once you've identified them, and you're likely going to end up with a long list and different contact names, then you're going to want to think a little bit more about, well, okay, who actually are these stakeholders and how do we get the most out of them? And I'm saying this because, which is not going to come as a great surprise, these stakeholders you've identified are not going to be equal. Each of them will come with a particular mandate, with a particular role, and also with a particular type of power. And I'm showing you this diagram to illustrate that stakeholders can have quite different types of power, and it becomes apparent usually in a conflict situation or in a negotiation situation when, for example, we might be looking for trade-offs. And MSP is a classic example of all of that. So what this is showing you is that different types of stakeholders have different types of power. So the red one, for example, this is an example from Germany, but it doesn't really matter. It's likely to be a similar arrangement for different situations. So in this example, the NGO, which is red, which is an environmental NGO, has a lot of information about a local conflict and also has a lot of legal support for what they are trying to achieve. There might be a local interest group which has strong support from residents for a particular issue. There might be a planning group which is also trying to look at a particular situation, perhaps negotiating for a particular outcome. Science, for example, very often comes with a lot of expertise, so they have power in terms of knowledge. The public authority, for example, in a negotiation situation, if it's about a decision, let's say, about a development in an area, they usually have a lot of communication power, a lot of negotiation power, if they are the ones driving the process, for example. And last not least, you might have an investor, someone who perhaps has a lot of financial power. If you think of the example of a wind farm, for example, usually there's someone who is backing that project, who will then say, I can finance this, so they have a lot of financial power. The example doesn't really matter too much. The point is recognizing these different powers, so to speak, in your stakeholders is important, and it can be useful in MSP situations and in any kind of situation where trade-offs and where conflicts might become an issue. And that feeds into the next slide, which tries to highlight the importance of a targeted approach to stakeholder involvement. So that again comes back to mandates, to power, and to influence different stakeholders have in a process. If you think about MSP, it's quite likely that different sectors perhaps have different levels of influence. Some of them might be very strong because they have a lot of political support. Others might be quite small, maybe because they are not as important financially or because there's fewer people in that particular sector. Some sectors might have a lot of power because they simply have a lot of financial power as well. So there's different ways of determining the level of influence a stakeholder can have over a process, and sometimes that also depends on mandates. So what this box is trying to say is that it's useful as a planner, as someone trying to organize an MSP process, to think about these different stakeholders and how best to meet their particular needs in an MSP process as well. And it's also sometimes a question of resources. It may be impossible to really go and talk to everyone in the same level of detail. So you might have to choose also which ones are you going to focus on most, and which ones are the most important ones also to get on board, which are the ones that can really maybe also run a process into the ground, which are the ones that really can make or break an MSP process. And those tend to be the ones that are in the red box in this particular diagram, the key players. So they are the ones that really everyone should focus their attention on primarily. So those are the ones you really must have on board. That's because they have a lot of influence, a lot of power. And they might also be the ones that are just most interested in the process and in MSP and in a good outcome. So those are the ones that are worth engaging a lot. They are the ones that you need to talk to and consult more regularly, perhaps, compared to the ones that are less important in your particular case, which will be the green box. So those are the ones that perhaps aren't all that interested in MSP and don't have an awful lot of influence and power. So those are the ones you want to keep them on board. Of course, you want to make sure that they're informed, but maybe it's not worth spending all that much resources and effort on keeping each one of those happy. I next want to look at different intensities. Again, it comes back to different purposes of involvement. And the first point is to illustrate the difference between consultation and engagement. Now, consultation is usually a legal requirement for any draft marine spatial plan. And that is when stakeholders usually provide written comments or feedback to government, to the planners or decision makers on a draft document. Whereas engagement is really quite different. So that really means stakeholders directly engage in a dialogue throughout the entire process, making sure that their concerns and aspirations are understood. That's the first point, but then also considered in the decision-making process. Now, some of that also happens through consultation. So when you give written comments on the draft plan, for example, then yes, of course, the planners will also take that into account, but it's quite different when that happens directly, when there's direct dialogue, for example, when there's direct engagement between the stakeholders and the process. So here is a way of unpacking that a little more. So on the left-hand side, you have the information provision. That's really the lowest level of involvement, consultation and involvement at the center. But it then actually can go all the way to proper collaboration and also empowerment. And that is really when you actually give over the power of the MSP process to your stakeholders. So that would be a case when the authorities or when whoever does MSP is no longer actually in the driving seat. So that is complete empowerment of stakeholders. Here's another picture, another illustration of exactly that. And here it's depicted as a stairway, and it shows the different levels of power sharing and intensities of interaction. So again, we start with information at the bottom, going all the way up to decision-making and process responsibility. So there, much more power is being shared. There's much more intense collaboration between stakeholders and planners than compared, for example, to the center, to the middle stages here, deliberation or collaboration. And all of that, of course, on the one hand, depends on the legal base upon which MSP rests, the resources available in the MSP process, and the capacity also of stakeholders. Are they even able, for example, to really take on some of that responsibility? Do they have the power, the resources, the time, the commitment to do this? Let's next look at when do we actually involve stakeholders. It's all very well, thinking about how would we like it to be ideally, but we must remember that MSP is a process which is a fairly complex cycle really of stages and steps and different steps require different types of stakeholder engagement. And this is an example of just any old planning cycle, really. This one is from the UK, and it's a very detailed description of how the English marine planning goes, so to speak. So it starts like any planning cycle at the top, selecting the planning area, going around the right-hand side, you identify your issues, you start bringing together evidence, you draw up visions, objectives, you start drafting your plan, you review maybe different planning options, you have an independent SEA maybe, or a sustainability appraisal in the case of England. The plan is then adopted, it's implemented and then reviewed, and then the cycle starts all over again. So the usual MSP cycle, which does, however, center around stakeholder engagement. That's the orange circle near the middle. So when is a good time to actually bring in stakeholders? This is another depiction of essentially the same thing, which tries to show also the overlapping nature of these stages, because MSP processes, even though we depict them in these neat boxes with the neat arrows all following on from each other in this nice and simple way, it isn't like that in real life. Of course it isn't. Stages overlap, things happen, delays occur, you might jump between one stage to another. You might also have to go back to repeat some things, perhaps if one's into difficulties. So this diagram tries to depict this overlapping nature of the different stages, which are the drafting and consulting stage, the implementation stage, and the evaluation and learning stage, then connected together to the scoping stage. So, as you go round the circle again, you think, well, okay, what's my next MSP plan going to be about? What's its scope going to be about? And what's the scope also of my participatory process going to be? And you'll see that here in this diagram, MSP is kind of ringed by data and information and knowledge needs. So that's really what the plan is going to be based on, and the participation process for citizens and for stakeholders. And I've shown this diagram also to depict the different involvement needs according to these different stages. So you'll see at the beginning of an MSP process, when we are still in a scoping phase, when we are drafting an MSP plan, there's going to be a lot of consultation needs and a lot of processing of information going on. So that is likely where there's going to be a lot of stakeholder interaction, just to find out from them what's important to them, what data they might bring to the process, what information, what knowledge perhaps they are keen to bring to the table. Then there's going to be a process of deliberating, of making sense of all that information that's been brought together. Maybe other types of consultation taking place. Some thoughts perhaps going towards, okay, what are the planning options and how are we going to address some of the conflicts? Then there's probably going to be a decision on, okay, this is what we're going for. That's what the draft plan is going to look like. This is how we think, the various interests can be represented best. So it goes into another consultation round during that decision-making process. And then the final decision, that's when the plan is actually passed, so to speak, and so it's adopted. Then it goes into implementation and evaluation, and you can see that the interaction then tails off towards the end. When we go to implementation, there's likely to be quite a bit less direct stakeholder interaction once the plan is up and running, once the plan is being implemented. So different needs for stakeholder involvement according to the different scope of these various stages, aligned also, not least, with different data requirements, different information requirements. I want to emphasize the difference between formal and informal involvement. So it's almost like comparing what has to be done by law, usually, and what can be done, what could be done, what can be an add-on. So formal usually what's prescribed, usually written consultation as a minimum, versus informal. And there, I think that's really a great chance, a great opportunity to be creative also with stakeholders. It's an opportunity really to engage with people in different ways maybe as well, in ways that are productive, in ways that support your particular MSP process. And of course, it will depend to a large degree also on the kind of MSP process you are involved in. Whether, for example, it's a statutory process. Is it going to be something that is going to become a law, for example, an ordinance? Or is it maybe a local plan? Is it a smaller scale, maybe a voluntary plan? All of that has an influence, of course, on the kind of involvement and also the kind of opportunities that then come with regards to informal involvement. So there's, of course, hundreds of different formats one could choose. It will depend on resources, the money one has, the time one has, the constraints one operates under, but also maybe on the types of stakeholders, you know. Are they used to this kind of thing? Have they maybe been part of other participatory processes or not? Is it completely new to them? Are they motivated? Are they keen on actually sharing information, or are they a little bit hesitant? Are they maybe a bit nervous of talking to government, for example? Perhaps they've had a bad experience beforehand. And very often, specifically informal types of involvement do require particular skills also on the part of the MSP planners or the team that does it. You might need facilitators. You might need people to be scribes to actually take notes during meetings, for example. You might need people to also think out of the box. And those tend to be skills that may not necessarily be the skills of a classic MSP planner. So you might want to think about drawing in others, people who bring those skills, those people skills, those facilitation, moderation skills, and also maybe conflict resolution skills. When it comes to methods and approaches, one useful idea, at least I think, is to try and organize things a little bit more. And one way of doing this is to draft a stakeholder engagement strategy. That doesn't have to be a very complicated document, but it is a way of actually being a bit more systematic in what you are planning to do. And it also enables you to set out what you're going to do and talk to people and explain to people, to your stakeholders, this is going to happen. So Scotland, for example, I've just used them here to illustrate that point. Their stakeholder engagement strategy is very short. It explains the purpose, it explains the MSP framework, it explains the commitment of the planning authority to participation, it explains who the stakeholders are, and it gives a timetable so that people know what to expect. And from those principles, it is then a lot easier to actually also identify the engagement methods and the communication methods, and also which of the stakeholders perhaps need to be engaged in what format at what stage, and what type of communication perhaps makes sense for some of them and not for others. And this is just a list. It could be many other things that can be added to that list, and you can see that it ranges from annual conferences to workshops to very targeted meetings to one-to-one meetings to actually, as the planning team, going to the stakeholders and their meetings. There can be exhibitions, emails, Twitter, Facebook, newsletters, and so on. So it's a long list of many different communication methods, engagement methods that are available. So here is just, again, the importance of tailoring the methods and approaches to the types of stakeholders, to the resources you have available, and also to where you are in the process. So what's actually suitable when, who is going to have to be involved when, who might be able to support you, and is this event, is this activity perhaps more about gaining information from stakeholders, or is it more about developing solutions together? So is it more the instrumental side of things, or is it more the transformative side of things, perhaps? I want to summarize some key enablers of successful stakeholder integration, and that is really drawing on many past MSP projects, specifically in the Baltic, but also elsewhere in the world. But they've all kind of come to similar conclusions. So the first one is be very clear about the purpose of stakeholder integration and your process ethics. So know why you're doing it and explain that to your stakeholders. Second point, make sure that you carefully map your stakeholders and understand their respective needs and dimensions. So some NGOs, for example, might have very different needs from a big industry group or a big sector like shipping, which is a big international sector. Also, be clear what are the roles of these stakeholders and what possible influence might they have over the MSP process. Look at their mandates, look at their power, look at their support, look at the different types of power that they might bring. Then be mindful of different capacities also to participate and to conduct participation processes in a meaningful way. So that refers to both your capacity as the MSP planners, can I really go for a full-scale, proper, involved process? Or do I simply not have the time or the money to afford that? And the same goes for stakeholders. Do they have the capacity? Can they really stick with it for 3 years, for example? Make sure that you mobilize your stakeholders from the beginning. Make sure that you communicate to them and keep it up. It's really important to understand that stakeholder integration doesn't just happen during the planning process and doesn't then stop. It's actually something that needs to be kept up at a lower level, as we saw in one of the slides, but keep up that communication. Keep in touch, basically, with your stakeholders, also when you're not in an active planning phase. Next point is make sure that you have some institutional frameworks, or are aware at least of institutional frameworks that can be used. And then put in some good process management, and that comes back to communication, resources, and being clear about the objectives. And the last point I think also is very important, give it a bit of time. It does take a while for everyone to be, first of all, aware of MSP, and secondly, to trust this process. So don't expect for it to be perfect first time round. It might take the second planning cycle, or maybe even another planning cycle, for people to really come on board, to really get this MSP thing, which might be completely new to people. Germany right now is actually revising its marine spatial plans for the EEZ and has also run through stakeholder processes. This is just to give you an idea of the German process, and the message being that it is actually a fairly long process. So it started in 2018, the final plan hopefully available in 2021. And the objectives of stakeholder involvement in that process were fourfold. So firstly, improving the baseline for planning. So getting data, getting information, and also priorities from the various sectors. So here, for example, is some data, some shipping data in one of the maps. The other map is a sector map that shows offshore wind farm and development priorities. So baseline is the first objective. Second objective, get a clearer idea of priorities also for the sectors. For example, when it comes to shipping, what are the shipping routes that are essential? Or offshore wind farming, which are the areas that are absolutely essential to meet sector targets? Third objective, of course, is to improve the draft plan through formal consultation. And the fourth point, generate more understanding and hopefully also acceptance of the plan when it's final by the stakeholders. These are the steps that Germany is currently running through, and you can see in the different arrows that there's actually quite a lot of stakeholder involvement. Now, the red arrows are the mandatory steps, so that's what's prescribed by law, but the yellow ones are informal types of stakeholder involvement. So, for example, the second box in this flowchart Some expert meetings were organised, some sector workshops took place very early in the process, kind of just when the MSP revision began. So just to sort of get that information, to get opinions, to get priorities from sectors. And another one, then another informal step, one that doesn't necessarily have to be there, according to law at least, is a second consultation round. And again, accompanied by perhaps some direct contacts as well, talking to some sectors and specifically addressing some of the conflicts, some of the issues that these sectors bring. And you can see also a fairly broad range of stakeholders involved, ranging from statutory bodies to sector representatives, the federal states, and also the general public in that case. Different methods that we used in that process, I've already mentioned informal sector workshops and expert reports, that's another one. There were online meetings. Remember that this whole process has taken place during COVID. COVID, of course, placing many restrictions on face-to-face meetings. So there were online meetings and also, for the very first time, an online international consultation on the first draft plan. There's also interministerial consultation going on, which is not a public stage. And then there'll be a second consultation on the second draft, which is where the process is at right now as we speak. That's end of May. And all of that was flanked by a kind of ongoing communication. There was a homepage, there was a blog, and also input from a scientific advisory board all the way through that process. So the challenges maybe of interest of this current ongoing MSP process, well, COVID, running consultations or involvement online has been a whole new challenge. Nobody expected that, of course, but also time constraints. Remember perhaps the slide with the timetable is actually a very tight timetable, so not as many opportunities for informal involvement as planned perhaps. Also, clearly, stakeholders aren't equal. Some stakeholders are a lot more powerful because of political support. So that is a difficult balance to get right. Then another experience or a challenge is that planning decisions can be hard for stakeholders to understand. And MSP in Germany, in the case of the EZ, is maybe not yet quite that continuous process of dialogue that we'd want it to be. Then there's the usual issues with data not always being available. It's very difficult also to assess cumulative effects of sea uses, which makes it difficult then also for stakeholder engagement and addressing conflicts. And also one aspect I haven't specifically touched upon, but which is also, of course, very important, is planning is an international exercise. Planning does not happen in isolation. MSP plans from the neighbouring countries also need to be considered. And those are only now, of course, becoming ready as everyone is trying to meet the MSP directive's deadline of March 2021. Some lessons that have been learned in the German process. I'm still on that particular example, but I think some of the lessons learned there would ring true for many other MSP processes. So the value of informal workshops, sector-based exchanges, really, really important, especially in those early stages. Because that is an opportunity to explain the role and also the constraints of MSP. What can MSP do? What can it not do? What can we expect? What perhaps can't we expect MSP to address? And that's also important because the plan evidently isn't everything. So just because the MSP process ends with a beautiful looking plan, the process, MSP, doesn't just stop, it carries on. So the lessons learned in Germany very clearly, and the importance of making sure that any formal process, any formal consultation is flanked with a more informal exchange, that ongoing dialogue, and that specifically also refers to the political level, the ministries who ultimately, of course, have to agree to a plan, otherwise it's not likely to be endorsed. Thank you all very much for listening.